I went into art because I liked art, and I think I was ultimately seduced by what I liked, and I became less than what I think I should be. So now I'm a kind of a limited artist doing, limited things.
For more than 25 years, Carl Beam has challenged himself and his audience through works in an impressive range of media. He brings a mature, cross-cultural, and fully realized personal vision to contemporary Canadian art, and has inspired a generation of First Nations artists to go beyond the depiction of Indian myths to their own lived experience. Your Excellencies, Carl Beam.
Assembling this chronology, I have drawn from notations in Carl's sketchbooks, from his collection of catalogs and correspondences, and from my own voluminous travelogue record. His art always contains that unusual, unnameable something which engages us, inspires us, and takes us a little bit forward in our understanding of our current position. The excitement and continuity of his creative process was revelatory to witness. As his wife and fellow artist, I had the privilege of not only a shared life, but also to witness his creative process and to assist him with his projects for 26 of his 30 years as a practicing artist. He always worked through to completion on a project. Work first and eat later, he would say. His density of art production was achieved against a background of constant traveling and fluctuating financial circumstances. We went everywhere together and often took as many as 4 major trips a year. These were all work-related, either to attend an exhibition or symposium or to pursue the joy of continual exploration of places, art materials, and art ideas. The majority of these trips were long cross-country car trips with Carl and Anung and myself in a station wagon packed with art supplies, a frying pan, a guitar, and an accordion. There was plenty of time to talk and assimilate ideas. This fueled the excitement of living, and the excitement of living fueled the art.
I had a dream about my dad not too far after he had passed away, and he showed up and he looked at me, and I was like shocked to see him. And he said, "I don't know why everyone makes a big deal out of this." He said, "I feel like I've been to the spa." And I was so shocked, and he sat down on a picnic table outside of my mom's house. And I could see my mom inside. He just started asking what we were doing. I told him, "Well, we're going to have a big show of your work at the National Gallery." It's hard to feel like he's not here because his agenda is massive. Aakideh, brave-hearted, strong-hearted. It comes from when he was a baby, and there had been a bear that was kind of menacing the community, and my great-grandfather had shot the bear, so there was the body of the bear, and I guess he just crawled right up to it as a little toddler infant, and he was just crawling all over this bear. None of the other kids would go near it, but he wasn't afraid of it, not even at all. He was more curious, and that's when he got that name. When my dad was really little, he was the oldest of all the kids, and all the kids were on my grandma's trapping line, because she would trap. I think everyone around here did. She had a trap line on the North Shore somewhere, and they were all in the cabin, and all the adults were gone somewhere doing something, and this bear came up, like a great big bear, and it was trying to get into the cabin.
The bear come around and tried to come in through the screen door, and it was a hot summer day. And he broke the screen, and Carl had a broom and baffed at him a few times, swinging at him, and all the rest of the kids, myself, and I had 2 older sisters and a couple of brothers, younger and whatnot, sort of thing. Everybody was screaming, and Carl was banging away at the bear with the broom and got him out, and I managed to close the door.
And my dad took all the kids and he sat them all up on the top shelf of the cabin, like where the jam is and things. So they were all sitting up on the top shelf.
The bear just was really persistent. He wanted to come in. He grabbed a little baby mattress. He stuffed it through the window, and it fell out. We didn't have electricity. We had coal oil lamps at the time. So he took some coal oil and threw a match out, and woof, of course, it's big puff of smoke, and and the bear took off, but then we had to run outside and put the fire out because we burned a big section of the wall of the house. I remember we got in trouble because we almost burnt the house down, but kept the bear away. Aakideh was his name, and it means Braveheart, and so he really deserved that name. He really he really earned that one.
He thought of himself as an Ojibwe person, but he did contemporary art. Never felt he had to be native looking or anything like that. He just knew who he was. He wouldn't like to be limited or defined by anything. Like I say, he was really proud to be Ojibwe. Yeah, he wanted to move something forward, and he would deal head on with the obstacles involved, which were other people's perceptions. And that takes a lot of real energy and the type of energy and intent that Carl had, that type of intent. Set things straight, tell it like you want to tell it. Don't be afraid to say the things that need to be said. He did have that type of abandon and confidence, to go there with any statement that he felt like saying. The way that he really, really lived deeply in all respects, that's what I would remember. He was born in Chagrin, which was called West Bay at the time, and his grandfather was the chief. Carl was the one he was chosen to be the one who went to residential school. The one chosen, kind of happy, unfortunate word.
He was born speaking Ojibwe fluently. Yeah, he spoke it fluently until he went to residential school, and then after being in Garnier for years, he didn't know it anymore.
He told me that when he was shipped off to school, he'd go and he wouldn't see his family until he came back after the school year.
He certainly never talked about his suffering in residential school. That was his own personal territory. He did go into the topic in his art, of course. That's well documented because it surfaces in his art.
It stood for quite a few years, and it was only just a couple of years ago that they actually tore it down. And I feel like that was a big mistake. I think that it should have stood, and that they should have had a plaque or something. The marker, the physical place, reminds people what has happened and should serve as a memory to never allow such a thing to happen again. He said one of the big things that nobody's talking about here is the cultural loss.
The direct impact to my son, Riel, is that he's learning to speak now, and we can give him a little bit of his language, his ancestral language, but it's not fluent, and that's a sad state of affairs. It's not just him; it's also Anang. Carl didn't get to embrace his language again until she was in her teens or older teens, well past when she was first learning language or to speak at all. So that's 2 generations. That's 2 potentially broken links.
I think it's just one of those things that you would say it's fate or it's destiny to go through hard times in your life, but that they shape you. He would never directly talk about what had happened to him there at school. I feel like his experience at residential school absolutely made him the person he was. It opened up the world in terms of knowledge and education, but at the same time, that group of people were saying our way of knowledge, our way of education trumps yours, and yours is, not only is it not any good, it's forbidden. And to see one culture and another culture and this clash firsthand, and to be experiencing that and abuses of power, I think is absolutely the thread that runs through everything he did from start to finish.
Yeah, it wasn't like a great thing, but it was something that helped make him the powerful person that he was.
Carl's view of the world is informed by his Anishinaabiness, but it's very important from his perspective to say, I am part of the world, and I'm interested in all these things in the world, and I have every right to be, and I'll represent them to you from my perspective. You take out of it what is important to you, but I don't want you to interpret what I'm giving to you as Indian. Like any other artist, you have a message to say, nuanced by your cultural background. Okay, so Carl Beam's Sauvage. It's another work done on the back of plexiglass, so the images are layered and built up. Labeling this with the word sauvage is a play on the notion of Aboriginal peoples being labeled savage, sauvage, wild. Sauvage is overlaid over this image of Hiroshima again. So it's that destruction, that human capacity for mass destruction. But the predominant image is really the scene of the cemetery near the Garnier Residential School that Carl attended. It's really one of the only works where he's starting to deal with his residential school experience. He has the letters A and Z here, which appear in other works, which are references to systems again, the alphabet, the instruction of English language in residential schools, the loss of Anishinaabe, and then at the bottom, this rifle contained in a box. There's a text above it that refers to the salvage paradigm. But the salvage paradigm was this idea that since indigenous peoples were disappearing from North America, that ethnologists and anthropologists had to rush out and collect as much as possible and preserve it in museums before all the people were gone. So, Carl has a phrase here that says, salvage your own fucking paradigm. He's not afraid to say things like that. That's where he gets that reputation for speaking his mind.
I first became aware of Carl Beam in 1989 at the Beyond History exhibition, and he took part in a panel discussion there. And I remember at the time, and Anne was with him at the time, and I remember asking her after the discussion, I said something like, is he hard to live with, or like he seems kind of like irritable or grumpy or something like that. Let's just thinking a lot back. And she said, he's fearless. And I remember that word, and I thought, he's very confrontational, but he needs to be. And it's really good that there's somebody being confrontational, because it's confronting people to be responsible. He wasn't intimidated by anyone. His works very much are intellectual puzzles, as he talked about. I love to create puzzles. So what do I have to know to understand this puzzle? So you want to engage people in the puzzle. And he wanted to conduct an intellectual conversation with you. He makes connections between objects, between images, between our realities in the present, the past, the future, native traditions, non-native tradition, showing the gaps that we have between each other, and then showing where we can come together in those gaps to have discussions.
I had the first major show, I think, of Carl's. That was Altered Egos. I wanted a title that was personal, deeply personal, and that reflected, I thought, these various transformations of the self, his altered egos. I remember as well going, well, Carl, what do you think of my title? Thinking, oh, well, he's never going to go for this. He said, well, that's okay. But as long as you understand, we're altering their egos. So I met him in '78, and he was still, again, living in Sault Ste. Marie. He had separated from his older family, and he was living alone there. He had a capacity for rage, I think, that one could see, but I think it's sort of sublimated in the art. You know, you don't see that in the years, you know, that he had a new family with Anne, and I think that did sort of transport him.
I met Carl through his art. I met his painting. In the place where I was working, he had brought some paintings to sell. It was med science. I was doing medical illustration at the U of T. And this lady was selling artists' paintings, and his paintings showed up there. And I did a real double take on them right away because they were of such high caliber. And I felt his spirit in his art. Now that's a distinctive thing. When you feel someone's spirit in their art, that's a distinctive register.
I didn't look at the catalog for Altered Egos really until I was a lot older, and I remember looking through it and seeing the artwork that he had done and looking at the years and seeing that those pieces were done before he met my mom. They were done in '78, and the feeling you get off them when you look at them is very kind of chilling, because you get the feeling that it's like an outro.
The work that I saw there, he had large canvases that were maybe, well, they seem, when I look at the actual size of them, I'm surprised, you know, that they're maybe 4 by 5 but they loom large. They seem like 6 by 8s, you know, really big. But they, you know, he had 2 portraits of Sitting Bull, and with writing and personal notation and inscription, things like that. And I remember they were also very edgy, and they had this kind of finality and almost like an exit statement.
it's not very subtle. I don't think I'd be the only one to see it that way. One of them's called Dying in Time, and the other one's called Pathetic Shit. And it has 3 pictures of my dad in different positions and profile and side. And they seem like they're dissolving in the image. And underneath it says like abort and something like this man is completely fucked. He'd had a lot of hard times in his life, and I think at that point he was just in a very dark place.
His darkest work is also very funny. This infusion of humor into a kind of very serious, dark theme. He has this inverted, same X-ray skull, and this was the takeoff on, you know, Indian art as X-ray vision that he thought he should deconstruct. He painted himself as he saw himself. Again, looking at his own image as a persona. You come home to this, you can live with this. These are really good works to live with. I mean, they're powerful images, and yet they kind of transcend death.
You can just see it happen all of a sudden. Instead of these kind of dissolving, very dark, very final statements, you get things like International Validation Day, huge soaring eagles, brighter colors. The work, the quality, the caliber of his artwork is instantly enhanced upon meeting her.
When we first met, his themes were reconstruction work, renewal, International Validation Day, like an upward trajectory. I'd say we did that for each other. It was an upward trajectory for both of us.
He was able at least to transform the personal to the political better than anybody I know. So you have something that belies the beauty of watercolor. It's a picture of him, and as he said, he was no beauty. And you have somebody, he wasn't in bad shape, but there he was, and this is what he wanted to present himself as.
He always appears in his self-portraits and his work as this absolutely dour figure. It's humorous, but it's humorous to him. He's the one who's standing here kind of laughing at us, I guess. He's daring us to look. So I think the humor aspect is definitely something that gives him power. It's something that he takes for himself. He's not trying to make the viewer laugh, he's laughing at us. And this is really the thing about his pieces too, is he's looking out from all these pieces. He's the one who's claiming the power in all of his pieces when he's talking to the viewer. He's not giving away anything, but he's dictating everything.
I teach a second-year course in Survey of Aboriginal Arts, and the last couple of years I have done a whole 3 hours just on Carl. I take great delight in introducing people to Carl, and it really is an introduction. They just love the piece Self-Portrait in My Christian Dior Bathing Suit from 1980, and I tell them, you know, Aboriginal artists in 1980 had a sense of humor. When we had our discussion in 1991 at his home, he was saying we need to be looking at the individual experience of Aboriginal peoples, taking a really fine, what's the experience of being Native today?
We're in the New Mexico desert, and this is a little spot where we used to stop, kind of on the edge of New Mexico. There was an arroyo there. We'd park our cars, and we knew this spot really well. We'd go and look for prehistoric fossils and prehistoric clamshells and odd things. Sometimes you'd see a coyote there. Carl had this video piece planned. I held the camera and did the camera work on it. His art is always about layers and a back layer where the image is indistinct And the more indistinct, the more powerful. There's definite themes. This distrust of systems, grids, systematic thinking, the limitation of it, how that type of thinking existed in science. Autobiographical note 1. Suddenly, on the hot desert floor of New Mexico, it occurred to me that there was a way that we could win, but we would have to know what our enemy really looked like. See, we were talking about these things all the time. We were in dialogue all the time. I'd be pulling my images and he'd be pulling his, and we'd go to the photocopier, and then we had 2 books. Like, there was a book of working images and there was a book of work that was photographed. Some of that creative process that was happening, you engage the viewer, so you have, levels to engage the viewer.
This was not just an image maker, but someone who had an amazing understanding of not only First Nations culture, but Western culture in general. And the fact that Carl would invent images that essentially created a kind of parallel First Nations history that would cover that 500 years. So not just a Western history with Wolfe and Montcalm and American presidents and wars of 1812, but in fact a history that let you know there was this other life, in fact in large part a displaced life that was happening side by side and simultaneously.
So I think any of his paintings are exactly the same. He's got that blend of both cultures, or of spiritual connection with everything and anything around us, so and insight.
The ruler was, of course, literally a ruler. It was a measuring stick, but verbally it operated as another kind of metaphor, the notion of a kind of political dominance. And so the work would always fluctuate between a literal description of what it was and this kind of larger metaphoric life, where in fact it took in centuries of history and established a kind of simultaneity in time. So 500 years ago really lived alongside contemporary history. As an artist, that in large part was his role, to make works that not only worked of their own accord aesthetically, but also served a kind of educational function in the way they reclaimed that history, repositioned it, and opened it to new perspectives. I think he understood his project as a kind of reclamation project. It was about reclaiming that history that had been overwritten by Western history, white history in Canada. He would look back at histories, look through old family photos, look through archival images, President Kennedy, Abraham Lincoln, spirit dancers from the Southwest, and they were never just images to Carl. They always represented entry points to human stories, and that's what Carl's work pulled together.
Well, in 1989, he had already been working on Columbus Project work. So he wanted to do a video component. He was thinking, okay, Columbus and his men arrive. Things didn't really go good on the first voyage, I think. What happened to those people who were left behind? How did they die? Maybe part of the discord is that their souls are not addressed, or maybe there's some sort of shamanic work that could be done to make things better. And so we thought that could be part of the trip to the Dominican Republic. We would do a piece making crosses on the beach, laying to rest something.
So you see him wading in the water, and he's essentially, and weirdly, kind of becoming Columbus. And in that video, you see this kind of overlapping of identity. And I remember asking him, I said, so, you know, Carl, what are your thoughts about Columbus? And he said, well, I like Columbus. He was an adventurer. He was a discoverer. Those are things I can identify. That admiration came out of an admiration for this idea of a new world. But it's the political new world that Carl had issues with. The idea of an imaginative new world, that was Carl's world.
Carl Beam's The North American Iceberg, 1985. It's immensely important work. Carl created this work in response to an exhibition that was being held at the Art Gallery of Ontario called the European Iceberg. In part what he was saying was, why do we need to constantly reference a European history when we have a North American one?
Many people, in fact, now think back to the Art Gallery of Ontario in the 1980s, and the high point would have been the European Iceberg. So Carl very kind of subtly kind of decides, okay, here's my point of attack, here's my point of critique, and then in the end doesn't focus on that, but in fact does something that has a purely positive kind of construction to it. It showed great foresight on the National Gallery's part to buy that work and in fact use it to kind of kick off a whole attention on First Nations contemporary art in this country.
Carl said, you know, I was pleased with the purchase of the work until I found out that they were purchasing, you know, the work from Carl Beam, the native artist. Carl began to question, you know, how was his work being purchased? Was it being purchased as a great example of contemporary art, or was it being purchased as a unique example of an Aboriginal artist that will now begin to plug a hole for something that had been formerly excluded?
You can't be as perceptive as Carl and not be angry. You know, there was just too much stuff. He had a lot to say, and sometimes he could only do it by personalizing it. You're not representing a, quote, tribal style. I think that was also fairly radical. It was in your face, this is me, and I have something to say, by the way, about the news.
He, you know, includes his self-portrait. First we see, you know, a very contemporary man with facial hair. We don't immediately, he doesn't fit into a limited concept of what an Aboriginal man might be thought to look like. But he includes it in three views, so we start to read it also as a mugshot. And he also includes his handprint, which is another very strong kind of personal signifier, but also has other references. The artist flying still, and then underneath he puts in space. But what does that mean? Is the artist still flying? Is the artist flying in stills? As we see, you know, with a series of stills, the Edward Muybridge photos, so there's actually flight in still. Then you have, you know, you jump to an image of a rocket, an image of a raven, Geronimo, this iconic image for Carl that repeats in many of his works, the prairie wedding or graveside scene, and then the Anwar Sadat assassination.
I think some of his watercolors, you know, where he wasn't trying to be epic scale, I love, because they were the inner mind of the Carl that I loved. They were lighter colors, they were freer images, he could take more risks. In a way, almost like a sketch pad for some of the other formal things that he tried later. I have a sort of what I consider a double piece, transubstantiation. The subtitle on it is Whereby Deer Becomes Venison, and it's a counterpoint to transubstantiation, the deepest mystery of the Catholic Church, and it kind of takes it apart, and yet elevates it in a way, doesn't destroy it, but transforms it onto another level.
I think when you look at his art, there's a lot more of poetics and beauty. Really, I think anybody who looks at the topics that he was discussing would have to own some of that emotion themselves. And whether you're talking about residential schools or damage and harm to the environment. I think those are serious topics. He had to address some of them with a certain amount of force.
Every time we'd see an animal documentary where they're strapping the microphone onto the ear of the wolf or the fin of the whale, he'd just be outraged. He just couldn't stand that. And as if measuring all these things is going to tell you anything about the whale. There's another way to really, really know what's going on with a whale. And it's a different type of knowing.
I think he really did have a worried heart and was very concerned about the issues in the country today. He was a real philosopher, and I think he wanted the general public to really care about his work and care about the issues that he addressed in the work, which very much was about let's take care of the world and each other. He was always challenging people to elevate the conversation.
I think there's a lot going on in Whale of Our Being. I see a criticism of Western society's ability to live in the world with the world. What I take out of it initially is thinking about whale and its totality. I think Carl was really trying to get us to think about how what happens to whale happens to us.
He's worried about the world and whether we're taking care of it responsibly. And I think in a lot of the self-portraits that he did, where he seems somewhat confrontational, he's looking right at the viewer, but he's engaging with them one-on-one and trying to get them to become more responsible to the state of the world.
There was an evolution of imagery. In the Whale of Our Being work, there's a lot of images of Jennifer Lopez. And I think that would be the first use of a pop icon in his work. You see what the culture's absorbed with, as an artist, and you say, well, okay, I'll meet you there.
I often mention the piece in the Whale of Our Being show that has a picture of Jennifer Lopez in it, and it's a kind of a teasing piece. And you're kind of wondering, is she going to take her shirt off or not? And Carl, I think, included that because he thought our fascination with infamy and celebrity has sunk to this level. There are a lot of issues we should be talking about. Whether Jennifer takes her shirt off or not is certainly not one of them.
When he was doing the Whale of Our Being, he started including a lot more of wide-ranging characters and figures in the iconography of the Whale of Our Being. And when he did that, he included some musicians. A lot of the musicians that he liked were kind of poets in their own right. So it was just his way of combining some of the poetics of Robert Johnson and the poetry of the early blues and combining it with his own images and his own, kind of making his own visual blues song. And I think that's what Crossroads is.
Here's Dad playing music. He was a fantastic musician. This is him playing slide, dobro.
I can't really remember a time where I would walk into the house and not hear him playing guitar. Normally I would come in and he would be sitting in his chair, he had his favorite guitar and his favorite amp, and he would just be sitting there playing, filling the house with music, and, loud, it just went everywhere, all through the house,
We played guitar in the kitchen.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be cooking, he'd be playing guitar, and the guitar went with us everywhere we went. And sometimes it seemed like that was his way of engaging in an abstract thinking level.
Yeah.
He'd just be like looking out in space and
just free form playing.
Just free form playing
for
and
hours.
He was just kind of balancing his hemispheres, we'd call it.
You'd stand in front of him and be like trying to talk to him, and he would just keep playing and he would just look at you. And you just couldn't get through to him at all. It was just like he just wasn't even there. He would look at you and just kind of go. Kind of with the large images of Robert Johnson, and then the anatomical bird heart image, and that is in his iconography from the time he meets my mom all the way through to the very last artworks he does. The images of the bird, the heart of the bird, and to me I think that represents him, that he uses that as an image of himself. Blues was so huge for him, and music was so huge for him, that he did so many artworks with musicians, modern musicians. He did portraits of almost all of his favorite musicians.
Yeah, well, I'm Carl's youngest uncle. Yeah, well, we grew up over here. We had a home right here. Stayed here a few times in a little trailer I had. We always had good times. He liked fiddle work, he liked guitars and stuff. Yeah, we had a lot of fun with music. But he was shy of crowds, crowd shy. You couldn't get him to get up on stage and to say anything. Couldn't get him to play a tune. He'd be standing there, he'd fall right over. He was funny that way.
I remember when he won the Governor General's, and we all went there, and he brought my grandma, and we got an extra room at the hotel there, and it was filled with all his family members and sisters and everyone. A lot of people came out for that, and when he accepted the Governor General's award, he said,
"And I'm very proud to be here tonight, and that members of my family could be here. My wife, my friends."
But my dad's whole thing was, he said he thanked his mom, he thanked you, and then he said that he thanked his whole family. And for all purposes, that includes everyone. You're all part of my family. And
I'd say my tribe now includes you. This is Carl and I getting married in New Mexico. We did our own ceremony and took our own wedding picture on the side of the road. We parked the camera on the hood of the car. In New Mexico, we worked outside all the time, preferably by the dark of the moon. That was great how much outdoor living you could do there. You know, painting outside, watercolors outside, ceramics outside.
one thing I remember my dad doing a really great big painting, and I remember him asking me, saying, what color do you think I should do this? And I think I was 3 at the time, so I was like, pink, should be pink, and he did it, and it was like pink and a gradation across to white in the painting. He was always really great like that with me, like even being 3 years old and him involving me in his artwork. He was like that my whole life.
I like this photograph a Nung took of, this is Carl and myself in the front seat of the car. It looks like the New Mexico landscape, and she took that from the back. Sometimes she'd do drawings of the back of our heads, and they'd be really good. The year 1999, when the Ojibwe Cultural Foundation was finally getting its new building. And then it became time to do the gate. He said, okay, I'll donate a gate.
My dad had designed the Shaman Family, and that has an image of like a shaman with the buffalo horns, and then he's holding onto the hands of his family.
So here it's done that the people can join, they can hold hands, and they can enter into that circle of shamans. They can enter into to hold hands with them. The psychology of how it's represented, he really worked on that.
Because the Western world has such strong feelings about horned figures. He gave me like the lesson on how to do it, and he had that just worked out stroke by stroke on how to do it. And I had one thing that was just slightly off on mine, and he was teasing me that I had made like the Shaman Family, you looked like Batman.
Originally, the only one with the buffalo horns would be a male figure. And then later there was a female one who had the power.
He changed his iconography of the Shaman Family, all of a sudden included more shamans than just the one large central shaman.
Right.
That was like his way of making our family strong, to envision the Shaman Family and to talk about shamanistic practices with art. That was something that he was really aware of.
He wanted Native people to be seen, not just as the lone savage in landscape or something, but that they were they had families, and that's part of the autobiographical nature of how he was, that went into his art. He wanted people to know that.
Me and my dad actually had a lot of conversations about the name, and one that stands out in particular is we were talking about it, and we were talking about how it's not really our name, and it doesn't really have any true relation to our family. It was one of my grandmother's later husbands. His name was Beam, and so it's not my father's father. My dad's father was actually Edward Cooper, who was an American, and he came from Philadelphia. We were sitting on the two-seater in the house, and he was telling me, well, I would have changed it, but I'm kind of stuck with it now. And this is after he had been, painting under Carl Beam for more than 20 years, so there was no going back.
Like, there are a few real important facts to remember about Canada. One is that the population is always growing, and we're running out of trees. So those two things alone could almost, like an exercise in logic, say, therefore, we should change our building methods. Now, why isn't that happening? It's like I said, it's just inertia. We're in a recession now, but the reason we're in a recession is because we're bankrupt on ideas, not money. I said, well, my contribution will be to build a house that doesn't use the wood that everybody wants to save and preserve, like the big pine wood. And we did that. It saved, I think, at least 300 trees. I feel like I'm in a big castle or something with substantial walls, and plants and things like that, not a Mickey Mouse 2x4 stick house, you know, somewhere in suburbia. Good house, yeah? Adobes in Canada.
We don't have pictures of the whole house building thing here, but it begins somewhere in this zone. This is the second building we built together, the studio. And Carl's standing inside the studio. I took the shot of him there. It's framed up. That was 1994. We built the house in 1992. A nun gave us this present for our wedding anniversary, and it was this cardboard adobe house. It had a little cactus, and it was made out of cardboard. She probably said, "I know what my mom and dad would like. They'd like it in an adobe house." I think I'll give them that. And we're thinking about house building and all this, and I start to get this idea. I migrate away from the frame house thing altogether, and I say to Carl, you know, why don't we build an adobe house? And the idea just lit with us, you know. We started making experimental blocks in our subdivision there. We're using sand and clay from outside Peterborough. We're using tar from the hardware store, and we're mixing things up. Neither of us had owned our own house, and here we were in our 40s. We said this is our biggest ceramic project yet. Mm-hmm. And everything that we learned in ceramics actually was very, very useful, because we had to develop the right aggregate blend of clay and sand.
When I'd first thought of doing the show highlighting the ceramic work by the Beam family, one of the things that I would have absolutely loved to have done was to have somehow been able to bring this house there and make it part of the show. Carl and Annie always talk about how people said for about 3 or 4 years, they said, oh, it doesn't seem like the Beams are doing any artwork. And they were building this. They were digging the earth and making the bricks and figuring out the plans and getting the trees cut, and built it all by hand. And it's not an ordinary house. It is a work of art in itself, and it's their biggest ceramic project to date.
Carl would say to people, yeah, but you know, it's a lot of work 1 year, but after that, it isn't work for 25 years or 30 years. We did a show called Look Ma, No Mortgage and things like that, just to emphasize, you know, that aspect of it.
And when you look at his artwork, when you get here and the house is built, all of a sudden the art really, really takes off. I think anyone who's moved away from their family home and land, and especially I think if you happen to be a native person and you come from a reserve and it's your family land on that reserve, it's quite a thing to be there as a child, leave, and then to come back. And not only just come back and like just rent one of the band houses, but to build a massive home out of cutting-edge technology, really, cutting-edge ancient technology, and then right in the middle of his grandfather's field.
If you want to change, you can change it. For me, earth housing via adobe blocks, earth blocks, and respect for Mother Earth, that's one way, okay? It's got nothing to do with a lot of other things, but that's my contribution. And how humble it is or how great it is, I don't know. I think it's making a difference.
He always said that greed was going to save everybody in the end, eventually. That people would get so greedy, they'd realize there could be a lot of money in making things green and healthy and the planet. And I think we're starting to see that now. People are realizing there's a lot of money in organic food. Hopefully he was right. Maybe our planetary greed eventually will make us want to save ourselves. I remember him telling a lot of people to fuck off. And I think that's been a really strong influence in my life. Just to see him and how he didn't care what other people thought. He wasn't doing anything to make people like him.
I think he showed that there's a market for contemporary work reflecting contemporary Aboriginal realities. You know, a work like Columbus and Bees, to say, well, you know, this is baffling. An image of Columbus, an image of bees. And then you start thinking, well, okay, Columbus was the discoverer. He then brought with him the idea of scientific analysis and categorizing things. And bees, here they are, a natural history museum, a natural history display, and how about we connect that with the history of Aboriginal peoples.
Carl lived his life and created his artwork based on what he felt was the appropriate action and reaction to what he had observed. His art, his activism was never ever about one culture triumphing over another. It was about looking at what was good, what was right, what was powerful, what was beneficial from any culture, and using it for the greater good.
The gallery is also the home to Gama FM, which is a Ojibwe language radio station that my father started a couple of years before his passing. My dad figured that this was the best way to actually affect change in the language. It wasn't going to happen in books because we've had all kinds of people who wrote books about Ojibwe. They wrote dictionaries, they wrote lesson plans, and that just doesn't stick as much as somebody on the radio station talking about the hockey game. The whole idea is anything can be on the radio station, anything at all, as long as it's in Ojibwe. The main thing being the preservation of the language and to popularize speaking of it. My whole childhood, there's like this real kind of culture, this real feeling of shame around language and how much you knew or didn't know, or if you were saying things properly. And you know, you'd almost be scared to even say anything because someone would come out and they would like correct you kind of harshly, or like it was a real strange thing. It's a strange thing to be in that situation about language, because the confidence to speak in your own language is so much part of the confidence of yourself.
We figure now that it would be great if other reserves could start up their own language recovery stations, is actually what we're calling it.
And that's why I think it's a great legacy of his.
There's a new wind blowing, and the revival is so much stronger than what it was. It's because of Carl and people like him who have that sort of that spirit of no, seriously look at what's going on. Give it a good look. I have things I need to say, and I'm going to say them, and he faced a lot of pressure, doing what he had to do. I found him to be an amazing observer of life and human interaction. It's almost like, in a way, he could see things coming.
Carl is still with us. I mean, I can spend 3 hours and survey Carl's work with my students, and I can mention at some point that Carl is no longer with us. But in a sense, I'm betraying that. I'm saying, but he is, and look at how present he is.
Around Time Warp, which other works are being installed there? Remember which ones?
Exorcism.
Oh, Exorcism is in that room too. We also need to talk about the tour. So with the different.
We really wanted to impart through the catalog what was to know what Carl's impact was in the community, and that's not something that we often get to hear about. He was a musician, and that was very important to him. Activist, interested in preserving language. And he was very committed to the cultural center and to promoting culture. So I think all of that is part of that bigger package of what Carl is. Right now we're just looking at really a selection of the ceramics that are in the show. There's quite a number of them. I think there's 20 or so. Some really early works that show his experimentation with the medium, and then also his mastery of the medium in different techniques.
He was never playing to the art world, which was what was so refreshing about him. He was playing to his personal life and to his sense of a historical life. And in that, I mean, he's an incredible role model.
He spoke from his time, but he spoke so insightfully that it covered all these ranges that we're only now discovering.
Okay, we're walking down the street in the early days. We're living together in Toronto. We'd been together maybe a month or so. And he said, we don't have a lot of time together. He said, we probably have about 5 years. And he said, I'm going to die first, and you're going to live a long time. And it's going to seem like a long time. It'll be a long time on earth. But in spirit, it's not going to be long at all. And we'll be together like that again. And he's telling me this incredible story. Well, this wasn't unusual. I mean, we'd go from mundane into things like this all the time, you know, those little segments like this. Later on, it turned out that we had 26 years together. And somewhere along the line, you know, in the highs and lows and the tougher parts of married life, I think to myself, was that some kind of cheap male trick telling me we had just 5 years, you know, so that, because, you know, because there wasn't any time to like address, you know, solve this problem or solve that problem, because you're so grateful to still have your husband, you know, you're so grateful that you were still together. And I was just a little chuckle to myself, but I never articulated that because I didn't get glib about it. It was still always pretty serious. He underestimated my contribution to his longevity. Yeah.
My dad used to say, he talked to a lot of people about investing things and what you're doing with your time and everything, and he said that I was his greatest investment. And he was investing in me. He said, I'm investing heavily in Anung features.
He was always a fun guy to be around. Like I said, he was like a big brother to me. I loved spending time with him. He was a terrific musician. The favorite song that we had, and when I hear it, I always think of him. And he had a really good way of singing it, but it goes, there were 7 Spanish angels at the altar of the sun. They were playing for the lovers in the valley of the gun. When the battle stopped and the smoke cleared, there was a whole bunch of us, and I think that's who we were, eh? The 7 Spanish angels. And 7 Spanish angels took another angel home. He does a better job of it than I do.
There were 7 Spanish angels at the altar of the sun, praying for the lovers in the valley of the gun. When the battle stopped and the smoke cleared, there was thunder from the throne. And the 7 Spanish angels took another angel home. She reached down and picked the gun up, lay smoking in her